Track. Again, I'm Bruce. I'm an alcoholic.
Bruce.
And I would like to thank Chris for inviting me here tonight. This is called the Sicker Than Most. I don't know if it's coincidental or intentional, but I ran across an old movie review I wrote 24 years ago, and the last sentence of the movie review was, "I really love this movie, but some of us are sicker than others." So apparently I'm in the right place. I will briefly tell you what happened, what it was like, how I got here, and what it's like. I was kind of a late starter to drugs and alcohol. I was 16, I guess, when I smoked pot before I really got drunk. And I'd been afraid of doing all that stuff growing up. I'd heard all the bad messages about how bad drugs were. My parents didn't really drink, very rarely. But I sort of started doing it because my friends did, and they've been drinking for years. The first time I did drink that I really remember, it was to a total blackout. Now, I didn't know that was a blackout. I didn't know what blackouts were. I just thought that's what happens when you drink. And that would be a part of my drinking as long as I did it. That would be a big percentage of the time how the night ended, was in a blackout. I got into some legal trouble back in 1976. It was drug related, but the cool thing that happened, and I thought it was horrible at the time, was I got a probation officer who ordered me to go to the basement of the courthouse one night a week to this weird place where people would come in and talk to us about what it was like when they used to drink. Now, I had no idea those were AA meetings. I'd never heard of AA in 1976. And I didn't really think I belonged there, and I didn't look like any of the other people there, and I was younger, but I picked up on that thing about blackouts. And I identified, I'd always thought an alcoholic was somebody, passed out on the sidewalk, drinking out of paper bags, and that was not me. But I heard these other ways to identify alcoholism, and I totally related. And I realized, oh, wow, I'm an alcoholic. But they didn't talk about drugs back then, and I wasn't really prepared when I was 22 years old to stop doing everything. So I pretty much stopped drinking, and I also stopped going to those meetings the minute I could. But I had a taste of the concept of AA and alcoholism. Fast forward 4 years later, courts intervened again. I got put into my first rehab. I got out of that after 2 years. It was something called the therapeutic community. And I was there for 2 years, and I got out, and I knew I was going to be clean and sober the rest of my life. And that lasted a few weeks, maybe. And again, they had a saying there of basically, if you go out, you won't be able to stop. But they didn't really push AA or the concept of this being a lifelong disease that I really have to treat on a regular basis, still to this day. So I got a job. I got a pretty decent job considering I was such a fuck up. And did okay there for a while, but over the next 6 years, drugs and alcohol totally took over my life. Now, I knew I was an alcoholic, so I shouldn't drink, but I would still drink. But I also knew I wasn't a drug addict because I knew what a drug addict is, and it wasn't somebody who did every kind of drug all the time, which is what I did. A drug addict was a heroin addict. So I finally had crossed that line. And here I am in this good job, and my life is a disaster. I'm worried all the time something bad is going to happen. And I finally got called into someone's office, and they said, "Hey, what's going on? You look like shit. You've lost your sense of humor. What's going on?" And I told this woman, and I could see she was shocked. And luckily, I was at a really good place to work. And she said, "We have something called an employee assistance program. You need to call this woman. Here's her phone number." So I knew this was really serious. So within the next few weeks, I made that phone call. because I didn't want to overreact and like do it right then. And I called, and one thing I always was dishonest about my drinking and my drugging, because you don't want people to realize how bad it really is. And I didn't want to realize how bad it really was. So I went down and I talked to this woman and I tried to minimize the situation. She said, well, that's not what I'm hearing from the people you work for. You need to go to rehab. So long story short, I went to outpatient rehab. I did great for 8 months, I think. And I went to AA meetings. I was always late. I never talked to anybody. And I went there as if it were a form of punishment. I wasn't looking to get anything out of it, and so I wasn't getting anything out of it. And so 8 months later, I relapsed. I went back a few months later, and it was worse every time I went back out. It got me back to where I was, like, really fast. Went back to rehab, outpatient again, got about 3 or 4 months, same thing. I had no real interest or connection to AA, and the concept of being powerless and not doing it a day at a time. Along the way, though, someone else I worked with who knew I was struggling, she said, oh, you know who you should talk to? You should talk to Bob over there. So I went over and I talked to Bob, felt really comfortable about it. Turns out Bob used to drink a half gallon of whiskey a day. He'd been sober, to me, what seemed like forever. He had like 6 years, and I thought that was almost too hard to believe. And he explained to me that he could be my sponsor and he could help me. And again, we worked in the same gigantic room. He could see me from my desk, so I couldn't really hide. But I tried to downplay. One thing I would never admit to was when I felt like getting high. Because in my head, if you feel like doing it, you're not doing it right. And God forbid anyone think I'm not doing it right. I want to be doing it right. But what always happened was I'd end up at home alone, and I would get that urge to use, and I had no defenses against it whatsoever. So, I guess it's kind of like when you'd see a lion in a cage at a circus, and the cage is way too small, and it just paces back and forth like it's crazy. That's how I was in my apartment. And then I would always get the brilliant idea, if I just go out and do it, I'll get it out of my system. Well, that's why I kept relapsing and kept going back. And finally, every time I'd go out, I'd be ashamed to go back to meetings and, raise my hand and say, I relapsed again this weekend. And I didn't really know people in the meetings, and I didn't feel right in the meetings. And every time Bob, my sponsor, would say, well, maybe you're not ready yet. Do you feel despair? Do you feel desperate? And I thought I did, but I still kept getting the same result. And he would always say, I'll be here whenever you're ready. Well, I finally had to go do an inpatient rehab. So I did 3 rehabs at this one job I had. And it was kind of like my last chance. And when I got out, it was the same as every time. I knew, they'd go around the room and they would say, a year from now, 2 people in this room will still be sober. And I always knew I was one of them. And so far, I've been wrong every time. I was never one of them. A year later, I was, high again. So I got out. I was all set to go. I had aftercare 3 nights a week. I was plugged in. I knew I was going to make it, but I still wasn't really taking AA seriously. And I had a bicycle crash like 2 weeks after I got out, and instantly my brain went to plotting a relapse. But I didn't want to just go out and do it, because this is how insane my thinking was. Rather than just say, fuck the rehab, I go to aftercare, I'm going to get high. I was going to get high just once to get it out of my system and keep going to aftercare. And was all I could think about as I walked 3 miles back to my apartment with my banged up bicycle. And I got in the front door and my sponsor called. And I said, "Hey, Bob, I just wrecked my bike and I feel like getting high." And he said, "Where you are right now, a hangnail is all the excuse you need." Now, that was the first time that I'd ever admitted, I mean, there's this thing, you're only as sick as your secrets. I thought it was a weakness and a shortcoming to admit that I felt powerless. And here it is, that's the first step, admitting you're powerless. And it was the first time that I had ever come clean and been honest about, wow, this is what's going on in my head, this is how I feel. And, you know, I'm not big on miracles, but maybe that was one, because from that day on, I never had the compulsion to do it again. It's not like I never thought about it. I don't see things that make me, for a split second, think, oh yeah, those were the good old days. But I lost the compulsion, and I realized that by getting the toxic stuff out of my brain and out of my head, I could actually do better. And it disempowered that bad stuff. And I mean, that's my only explanation for how that happened. I admitted a weakness, and suddenly the weakness was erased. Or it wasn't erased, but the downside of the weakness, the giving into it. And now, one thing Bob did as my sponsor was whenever I went to him with any kind of a problem, he always said, "I don't know what you should do." But they talk about that in step 10. Oh, they talk about that in step 3. He always referred me to a step because he said, "I'm not your higher power." Hold on. Sorry, my timer went off. So I know I have 3 minutes. Anyway, he always referred me to a step, and he said I usually recommend to people I sponsor, find a step meeting, go to it every week. Well, I started doing that. I'm coming up on 33 years sober. I've been going to step meetings almost every single week for the last 32 years. And it is the rock solid foundation of my program. I need to be reminded every week that whatever is going on, good or bad, in my program and in my life, that there's something that's really important in there. Now, I can kind of tie this in, I guess, with the 5th step, which is our topic this week, because the whole idea of, it says here, they'll tell how they tried to carry the load alone, how much they suffered of irritability, anxiety, remorse, and depression. That's what I learned when I told Bob that one day, I feel like this. I unloaded this thing that was really dangerous for me to keep to myself. And now, unlike whoever it was earlier who got the 10 years, I did not whip through my steps. I dragged my feet as long as I could, and he had to keep pushing and prodding and pulling, but gently, because I wasn't in a rush to look at what kind of a person I really was. But what I did get out of it when I finally did a 4th and a 5th step, what I did finally really get out of it was that I'm not really all that bad. And I feel better, I felt worse if these things would just pop into me and I would have that stuff in my head spinning around telling me bad things, bad person, bad behavior, bad history, who wants you. And it made a huge difference. It says another thing here, the dammed up emotions of years break out of their confinement and miraculously vanish as soon as they exposed. My past doesn't have that power when it's exposed to the light of day. I mean, it's just that simple. And I guess that's all I've got to say on step 5. I will say one quick thing about tradition 5, because I read both of them today, and it talks, that's, each group has but one primary purpose: to carry its message to the alcoholic who still suffers. The only thing that matters is that he is an alcoholic who has found a key to sobriety. This is my sobriety is everything I've got. I mean, I talk how grateful I am every single day of my life. And I realized that there's only one place where I can go where that is the focus. That's where the specialists are. That's where it's the only thing that really matters to us is our sobriety and becoming, improving our relations with other people. So this is the place for me, and I am so glad Chris invited me here tonight. That's enough for me. Thanks.